In the MSOB, Stephen Baxter. Get moving, you old bastard. Bart went around the room, his white jacket already stained by some yellow fluid, and he de-opaqued the windows with brisk slaps. It took him a while to figure out where he was. It often did nowadays. So he just lay there. He'd been in the same position all night, and he could feel how his body had worn a groove in the mattress. He wondered if Bart had ever seen Psycho. I thought... His mouth was dry, and he ran his tongue over his wrinkled gums. You know, for a minute I thought I was back there, like before. Bart was just clattering around at the bedside cabinet, pulling out clothes and looking for his stuff. A hand towel, soap, medication, swabs. Bart never met your eyes, and he never watched out for the creases on your pants. My father was there. Actually, he didn't know what in hell his father was doing up there. The sunlight was real strong, and the ground was a kind of gentle brown, depending on which way you looked. Autumn colors. It looked like a beach, come to think of it. He smiled. Yeah, a beach. That was it. His dream had muddled up the memories, and he'd been simultaneously 39 years old and a little kid on a beach running toward his father. Ah, Jesus! Bart was poking at the sheet between his legs. His hand came up dripping. Bart pulled apart the top of his pajama pants. He crossed his arms over his crotch, but he didn't have the strength to resist. You old bastard! Bart shouted. You've done it again! You've pulled out your fucking catheter again! You filthy old bastard! Bart got a towel and began to swab away the piss. He saw there was blood in the thick golden fluid. Goddamn surgeons, always sticking a tube into one orifice or another. I saw my buddy jumping around, and I thought he looked like a human-shaped beach ball, all white, bouncing across the sand. Bart slapped at his shoulder, hard enough to sting. When are you going to get it into your head that nobody gives a flying fuck about that stuff, huh? He swabbed at the mess in the bed, his shoulders knotted up. Jesus, I ought to take you down to the happy booth right now, old bastard. Like a beach. Funny how I never thought of that before. It had taken him 50 years, but he was finally making sense of those 3 days. More sense than he could make of where he was now, anyhow. Not that he gave a damn. Bart cleaned him up, dressed him, and fed him with some tasteless pap. Then he dumped him in a chair in the day room. Bart stomped off, still muttering about the business with the catheter. Asshole, he thought. The day room was a long, thin hall, like a corridor. Nothing but a row of old people. Every one of them had his own tiny TV, squawking away at him, or her. It was hard to tell. Every so often a little robot nurse would come by, a real R2-D2 type of thing, and it would give you a coffee. If you hadn't moved for a while, it would check your pulse with a little metal claw. You had to set the TV with voice commands, and he never could get the hang of that. He'd asked for a remote, but they didn't make them anymore. So he just had his set tuned to the news channels all day. Sometimes there was news about the program. Mostly about the dinky little unmanned rovers that the agency was rolling around Mars these days, that you could work from Earth, like radio-operated boats at Disney World. Now, that was pure bullshit as far as he was concerned. But there wasn't even anybody up in LEO nowadays. Not since Atlantis tore itself up in that lousy landing, and the Russians let what was left of Mir fall back into the atmosphere. He tried to read. You could still get paper books, although it cost you to get them printed out. But by the time he'd gotten to the bottom of the page, he would forget what was at the top, and he'd doze off and drop the damn thing. Then the fucking R2-D2 would roll over to see if he was dead. The door behind him was open, letting in dense, smoggy air. Nobody was watching him. Nobody but old people, anyhow. He got out of his chair. Not so hard if you watched your balance. He leaned on his frame and set off toward the door. The day room depressed him. It was like an airport departure lounge, and there was only one way out of it, unless you counted the happy booth. Funny how it had been a Democrat president who'd legalized the happy booths. A demographic adjustment, they called it. He couldn't really blame them, Bart and the rest. Just too many old bastards like me. Too few of them to look out for us. No decent jobs for them to do. Sometimes, though, he wished he'd just taken a T-38 up high over the Mojave and gone onto the afterburner and augured in on those salt flats. Maybe after Gina had died, leaving him stranded here, that would have been a good time. It would have been clean. A few winter rains dissolving that ancient ocean surface. By now you wouldn't even be able to tell where he'd come down. Outside the light was flat and hard. He squinted up, the sweat already starting to run into his eyes. Not a shred of ozone up there. The home stood in the middle of a vacant lot. There was a freeway in the middle distance, a river of metal he could just about make out. Maybe he could hitch a ride into town, find a bar, sink a few cold ones. Screw the catheter. He'd pull it out in the John. He worked his way across the uneven ground. He had to lean so far forward he was almost falling, just to keep going ahead. Like before. You'd had to keep tipped forward, leaning on your toes, to balance the mass of the PLSS. And just like now, you were never allowed to take the damn thing off for a breather. The lot seemed immense. There were rocks and boulders scattered about. Maybe it had once been a garden, but nothing grew here now. Actually, the whole of the Midwest was dried out like this. He reached the freeway. There was no fence, no sidewalk, nowhere to cross. He raised an arm, but he couldn't keep it up for long. The cars roared by, small, sleek things, at a huge speed, 150, 200 maybe, and they were close together, just inches apart. Goddamn smart cars that could drive themselves. He couldn't even see if there were people in them. He wondered if anyone still drove Corvettes. Now there was somebody walking toward him, along the side of the road. He couldn't see who it was. The muscles in his hands were starting to tremble with the effort of gripping the frame. Your hands always got tired first. There were two of them. They wore broad-rimmed white hats. "You old bastard!" It was Bart, and that other one, who was worse than Bart. They grabbed his arms and just held him up like a doll. Bart got hold of the walker and, incredibly strong, lifted it up with one hand. "I've had it with you!" Bart shouted. There was a pressure at his neck, something cold and hard, an infuser. The light strengthened and washed out the detail, the rocky ground, the blurred sun. He was in a big room, white-walled, surgically sterile. He was sitting up in a chair. Christ, some guy was shaving his chest. Then he figured it. Oh, hell, it was all right. It was just a suit tech. He was in the MSOB. He was being instrumented. The suit tech plastered his chest with 4 silver chloride electrodes. "This won't hurt a bit, you old bastard." He had the condom over his dick already, and he had on his fecal containment bag, the big diaper. The suit tech was saying something. "Just so you don't piss yourself on me one last time." He lifted up his arm. He didn't recognize it. He was thin and coated with blue tubes like veins. It must be the pressure garment, a whole network of hoses and rings and valves and pulleys that coated your body. Yeah, the pressure garment. He could feel its resistance when he tried to move. There was a sharp stab of pain at his chest. Some other electrode, probably. It didn't bother him. He couldn't see so well now. There was a kind of glassiness around him. That was the polycarbonate of his big fishbowl helmet. They must have locked him in already. The suit tech bent down in front of him and peered into his helmet. "Hey!" "It's okay. I know I got to wait." "What?" "Listen. It was just on the TV. The other one's just died. What was his name? How about that? You made the news one more time." "It's the oxygen." "Huh?" 100%. I got to sit for a half hour while the console gets the nitrogen out of my blood." The suit tech shook his head. "You finally lost it, haven't you, you old bastard? You're the last one. You weren't the first up there, but you sure as hell are the last of the 12. How about that?" But there was an odd flicker in the suit tech's face, like doubt or wistfulness. He didn't think anything about it. Hell, it was a big day for everybody here in the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building. "A towel." "What?" "Will you put a towel over my helmet? I figure I might as well take a nap." The suit tech laughed. "Oh, sure. A towel." He went off and came back with a white cloth, which he draped over his head. He was immersed in a washed-out white light. "Here you go." He could hear the suit tech walk away. In a few minutes it would start. With the others carrying his oxygen unit, he'd walk along the hallways out of the MSOB, and there would be Gina holding little Jackie up to him. He'd be able to hold their hands, touch their faces, but he wouldn't feel anything so well through the thick gloves. And then the transfer van would take him out to Merritt Island, where the Saturn would be waiting for him, gleaming white and wreathed in cryogenic vapor, waiting to take him back up to the lunar beach. And his father. All that soon. For now, he was locked in the suit, with nothing but the hiss of his air. It was kind of comforting. He closed his eyes